Our last principle of design is movement, which is also synonymous to pacing, rhythm, and flow. To be clear, movement here does not refer to interactivity, animation, or other motion graphics. Those types of movement are beyond this tutorial. The movement we're interested in is the one that is implied within a static composition, and we're also interested in how well that implied motion can lead and guide the audience's gaze across the surface of a visual design. When it comes to data figures, I've found that movement is best understood when broken down into three major types. We'll be calling them inherent movement, habitual movement, and constructive movement. Inherent movement refers to how the content or subject can instill flow and directionality. In this example, there is a very strong diagonal flow created by the data itself. There is a natural tendency for our eyes to move from the lower left towards the upper right. So when we add in a figure caption to the slide, we might want to consider how that movement and flow might be used to create a more pleasing design. This lower right placement falls outside the natural resting spots for our eye. Its current placement means there are three competing focal points on the page. If we move the caption towards the upper right, however, since our eyes are already tending towards the spot, the caption feels less intrusive and more noteworthy. The design as a whole also feels more harmonious. When coming up with this case study, I also had the rule of thirds in mind, which brings us to the second type of movement. Habitual movement refers to how we as humans naturally tend to or are trained to approach information. Naturally, our eyes tend to flicker back and forth between the intersection of thirds in a 3x3 grid. That's why photographers tend to align their content along these lines. It's why portrait painters paint the eyes of their subjects around these focal points. And it's why I've chosen to position the graph in this way. Habitual movement also refers to how we're taught to read from left to right in the Western world. For example, when presented with a grid of graphs, the natural tendency for readers is to go through them from left to right, row by row. It's much less common for someone to read them from top to bottom, column by column, unless they have cues to do so, which is exactly what the arrows here are doing in what we call constructive movement, as in we, the designers, constructed them into the design. Of course, constructive movement doesn't have to be so obtusely implemented. If we add containers around each graph, the alignment and spacing can also be used to guide the viewers. Because the channels of space between the columns are larger, viewers are more likely here to read from top to bottom, column by column. Equalizing the space removes the effect of constructive movement, and by default, viewers will rely on habitual movement. If we want, we can enforce this habitual movement with constructive movement as well by closing in the horizontal distance of these containers. In the end, movement is about managing and curating the way our users experiences the data we're trying to communicate. But this isn't exactly something new. Since the very first chapters of this tutorial, we've been actively curating movement within our designs, even though we have not referred to it as such until now. We've been trying to anticipate inherent movement when we fret about proportioning and layout. We've been enforcing habitual movement when we make sure components and elements are aligned. And to the best of our abilities, we've been implementing constructive movement to best convey the visual and informational hierarchies we feel are most useful at communicating our data to our audience.